Neo-Impressionism was a true provocation.
A major scandal.
Taking art into much more uncharted waters.
A very special type of painting that is incredibly unique.
Is such an essential step to the development of art as we know it today.
From the 1860s, what we call the Impressionist painters were developing this mode of painting with great immediacy, ever-changing life around them. By the early 1880s, there was a growing general conception that we had to move on from that to something that had a greater artistic status, if I can even say that.
In 1886, in the final Impressionist exhibition, the French painter Camille Pissarro invited the young Seurat and the young Signac to exhibit with them.
Seurat shows A Sunday Afternoon on La Grande Jatte, a painting that has become like the icon of Neo-Impressionism. A work first which is much larger than any of the work by their Impressionist peers. But it's not only scale, it's also the way that the work is composed.
It was the first painting in which he adopted a technique he had studied and developed, which is now known as pointillism, the idea of applying pure colors placed side by side directly on the canvas rather than just mixed on the palette was particularly radical.
Even though when we look at Neo-Impressionist paintings, we're often thinking a lot about the dot, for the Neo-Impressionists themselves, the technique really resided in color theory.
A theory that was developed by Michel-Eugène Chevreuil in the earlier part of the 19th century, which essentially say that a color will become more powerful, more punchy, if you like, if it's displayed next to its direct complementary. So a green will appear greener if it's next to red, and vice versa.
They use the term divisionism because they were applying unblended color. And they believed that when you looked at the painting from a distance, it was the eye that would mix the colors together in this process known as optical fusion.
There is also an interest put in composition, in particularly in clarity of composition, in the essentialization of things. If you look at a lot of Neo-Impressionist works, they're standardized faces. They're not a particular person.
Certain of the critics who were very invested in a notion of, I suppose you would say, good taste, were appalled. You know, this was moving beyond my sensibility, my sensitivities, into science. I mean, who cares about that? Neo-Impressionism was a true provocation. And the people who took it up were saying, yes, I want to provoke. We're standing in front of Georges Seurat's Bathers at Agnières, a very large painting of 1884. It is his first attempt at a monumentally scaled painting worthy of the museum, if I can put it that way. But this is an abreuvoir.
Although it is not yet pointilliste, not yet painted with dots, it already shows the hallmarks of Neo-Impressionism, namely the division of complementary colors. And you can see that, for instance, in the blades of grass, where this brilliant green is painted alongside red that gives it that extra sort of shimmering effect, that extra brightness. It's also a work, if you're painting at that scale, that required careful planning. Seurat created a whole range of studies in Conté crayon on paper, with oil on canvas, to really carefully plan his compositions. Neo-Impressionism is a turning point also because it is the foundational moment, the first international art movement. The intellectual heart of Neo-Impressionism in many ways was not based in Paris, but was based in Brussels, where a very particularly radical and avant-garde artist society called Les 20, the 20 artists banding together, were particularly taken with Neo-Impressionism.
And each place had their own particular take on it. In Brussels, they were very interested in using this new technique to paint portraits. The Dutch perhaps were more interested in landscape as is so important in the Dutch tradition, the slightly older generation, particularly Pissarro, nonetheless were interested in seeing what the youngsters were doing and wanted to follow it. Among the most important was Camille Pissarro, a leading impressionist, who sort of in the mid-'80s said, well, this is interesting. What can I do with it? Van Gogh, young, he was the same generation as the Neo-Impressionists, but he thought the exact same thing when he gets to Paris in 1886. Oh, well, this is interesting.
You can see that he's really working on this contrast of complementary colors and also on the division of different pigments on the canvas.
It's also really key to understand that under the veneer of these works, these Neo-Impressionist works feeling like the beautiful, serene landscape, there is also pretty radical political ideology. As radical as the technique was in many ways. I mean, they're all anarchists.
Anarchism, which said that the best government is no government. It was a highly idealistic politics, a highly hopeful politics about equality that attracted many young people. It was the plight of the poor, the plight of workers that attracted their attention, that they hoped to be able to improve. A picture that particularly appeals to me is Maximilian Loos, his Iron Foundry. It's an extraordinarily powerful image. Within this context of anarchism, look, the workers together can make this happen.
It's really also a reaction against the industrial age. It is about sort of returning to nature, returning to leisure. And you have to remember that leisure, particularly for people who are working, is quite a new concept at that time. The idea that there was time off. And what do you do with that time off?
Arguably, one of the most important paintings is Seurat's Le Chat-Ou, what we now much more commonly call the can-can. The great dance invented in the clubs of Paris at the end of the 19th century. So what we're seeing in images like this, a new zone of freedom where you could go get yourself away from the constraints of everyday life. It probably was the closest thing that we would see to until rock and roll in the 50s. Helene Kröller-Müller is an absolutely fascinating figure who will change our perception of collecting in the early modern period.
She's born in Germany, in a very wealthy industrialist family, marries a Dutchman, Anton Kröller, becomes Helene Kröller-Müller, and they move to the Netherlands, and she discovers art, and particularly actually early on, the work of Vincent van Gogh. From around 1905, 1906, she starts collecting work, first for her own pleasure, but then very quickly at a larger scale. And after sort of suffering a sort of life-threatening illness, recovering, she feels sort of inspired to pursue a sort of grander mission.
She decides to donate all the paintings she has collected to the Dutch nation. And this is the start of the Kröller-Müller Museum.
She very early comes to understand that Seurat, Signac, Rieselberg, Henry van de Velde were doing something amazing.
For Helene Kröller-Müller, this particular method of application of paint on the canvas also had a meditative quality. There was something mindful in it.
In a way, looking at Seurat's Gravine series is a bit akin to looking at a mostly monochromatic painting by Rothko. It's a real sort of pursuit of harmony, and that's something that spoke very, very deeply to Helene Kröller-Müller and speaks very deeply to us today.
What you see particularly in Neo-Impressionism in its later years is an overwhelming simplification, more and more detail disappears from their canvases, particularly from the landscape paintings.
One really beautiful example of this is The Beach at Blankenberg by Henry van der Velde. Instead of capturing perhaps the depth or dimension of what a shadow might look like on the beach, it instead takes on this very flat and this very simplified form. And there are a couple of figures who occupy this space on the beach, but they're almost vaporized away.
Neo-Impressionism did not last long. It's really 30 years is a generous time span for it. It had tremendous significance, but then it was over.
It's one of those interesting experiments of the 19th century. But I think its impact is sort of more fundamental than that in many ways. First, because it is the first coherent movement and establishes a sort of blueprint for what was to come, the great isms of the 20th century, but also because it influences art in all sorts of ways. I mean, the Neo-Impressionist artists don't get there themselves fully, but it's part of a process of untethering of subject matter from the work of art. And the next generation is able to take that in a way to its logical conclusion, which is abstraction. And it's in that sense that Neo-Impressionism is such an essential step to the development of modern art, and in many ways, art as we know it today.